Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on the Values and Interests podcast. It has been a while since our last episode, which was late 2025, but obviously there has been a whirlwind of geopolitical news to start us off with the new year. And, honestly, I've been trying to figure out what the right intervention point is to have another conversation and not to just be chasing the news, but to really add value from a morality and a power and a Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs perspective. And I think we have the man with us today to be that great guest. So joining me today is Professor Paul Poast from University of Chicago. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Great. So Paul does a lot of research, a lot of writing. I constantly follow him on LinkedIn. Amazing follow, whether you're in the policy space or you are a student. If you want to learn about data cleaning or the theory of IR, he's a one-stop shop. So I highly recommend to follow there on LinkedIn. And today we are going to talk about realism. Realism in practice, realism as a theory, the history of realism, how it's changed over the years. And the impetus for this conversation is, I would say, from my perspective, an increased use of realism in the lexicon of foreign policy, especially around Trump administration 2.0 and their foreign policy. This is whether on the pages of the national security strategy, or whether it's Elbridge Colby today at the Munich Security Conference, or whether it's the speeches galore at Davos. So the Trump administration, Paul, is using realism. They are putting it out there as a pillar of their foreign policy. And so maybe we can kind of set the groundwork for how realism is emerging today, and then we can kind of strip back the layers and go back to a few thousand years BC to get the history of this thing going.
That sounds like a great, not ambitious plan for today.
We have 45 minutes. So
we have 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, so, to start off is, as you just laid out, it's like the term realism, the word realism is being used increasingly by folks writing about the Trump administration, and it's being used directly by people in the Trump administration. It's being used in official foreign policy documents, whether it is the national security strategy, the national defense strategy. It's being referred to by, if not by name, then at least by concept. If you're talking about Elbridge Colby, or if you're talking about Stephen Miller, they're all bringing up the ideas of realism and referencing it as such, or even using that direct word to describe their approach to foreign policy. And what that has also led to is then a host of people to latch onto that word and to say, well, why is that? Or maybe it does explain. And so you've seen a host of commentary about that. I've contributed to that. You've contributed to that. And so that's where really all of this is coming about. And, as I've recently said, realism is having a moment, but it's having another moment. I think it's important to kind of remember that realism was having a moment back in 2022 when Russia invaded, or had its full invasion of Ukraine. And that also prompted another period of time where people were talking a lot about realism, but it was different. It wasn't in the same context. In that case, in that instance, it was because there were certain academic thinkers, prominent thinkers, Henry Kissinger being one of them, who are associated with realism and realist thought, who were making comments about the war in Ukraine and about Russia's behavior, and specifically how it could possibly end. And that was leading to some criticism of them, and hence leading to criticism about realism as a whole. So yeah, this is, it's an academic idea. It's an idea I'm looking forward to talking to you about, but it's an academic idea that is, in many ways, has long been, if maybe always been, closely tied to practical policy and foreign policy. And so hence, it's not surprising to see it having yet another moment.
Yeah. So just for our listeners, from your perspective, this is the big challenge, always for definitions. Everyone wants a quick, short definition. How do you conceptualize, how do you think about realism from an international relations perspective?
So as I like to describe realism is the school of no hope. It's the school of no hope. And what I mean by that is realism has always been defined, and hence even the very word. The very word is, when it says realism, it literally means we're going to keep it real. Let's be real. Let's be realistic about this, folks. And what that means is realism has always defined itself in foreign policy debates, has always defined itself not so much by what it stands for, but what it stands against. And so it's usually been brought up in the context of people putting forward alternative views such as, going back to the end of World War I, views such as the League of Nations is going to solve the problem of war. Or we are going to sign a treaty, the Briand-Kellogg Treaty signed in 1928, that's going to ban war, and that's going to work. Or after World War II, it's going to be the United Nations and international law. That is going to solve the world. Or maybe it's the spread of democracy. And if everybody just becomes a democracy, that's going to solve the problem of war. Or maybe it's if everybody just traded with each other and we were more integrated economically, that will solve the problem of war. And so these have been the ideas that have always been put out there. If we can solve the problem of war, if we can just do X, Y, or Z, usually something related to international law, international institutions, spread of democracy, spread of economic exchange. And realism is always the school of thought, or the folks who sit there and go, not so fast, my friend. Right? They're the school, they're the Lee Corso of international relations thought. But no, they will sit there and say, no, it's not going to work that way. It is not going to work that way. Let's be realistic. And indeed, some of the earliest thinkers on this after World War I didn't use the word realism. They referred to themselves as the practical people. They even said that practical men and women. This was Philip Kerr. He wrote a piece in International Affairs, which at the time in the 1920s was the Royal Institute, the Journal of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, but Chatham House in the UK. And he wrote a piece, and he said, people will say that, international law can achieve this, achieve that. But he said, but practical men and women know that that's just not going to happen. And here's why. There's always a desire for someone out there always has a desire to control. Someone out there always has a will to power and will want power for its own sake. And that will never be quashed. That will always be evident. And so that's why we'll never be able to solve the problem of war, conflict, coercion in international politics. And so that, in a nutshell, is what realism is. It's literally this school of let's just keep it real. No. We're not going to solve this problem. It's not going to be about international law. It's not going to be about democracy. It's not going to be about this, because these things will never go away. There's always this desire for control, maybe not by everybody everywhere, but there always is. And so that's why you'll never solve it. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Well, why is it? Why do realists think that? Is it just being contrarian for the sake of contrarian? Well, there's probably some realists out there who are like that. They're just like, hey, if everybody else is saying it's the end of history, I'm going to say it's not. But there are that, in fact, that's been a big part of the debate, has been, why do realists think this? And there's been various answers given for that over time. And of course, that's something we can absolutely get into today.
Yeah. So no, I think it's really helpful kind of at a high level. I wanted to maybe back up a little bit to, again, another thing that's having its moment, I would say, in the information ecosystem are all these history professors who are now kind of jumping through at 100-year increments around great wars or great periods in history. So maybe we can do that quickly from a realist perspective. So, we've seen kind of this many talking heads now, whether at conferences or even in cable news, are starting to kind of refer to the Melian dialogue and this famous quote that's, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And this is kind of the spark of, I guess, realist thought in a big way. And then we go to Machiavelli, who's thought of as the amoral realist, and kind of there's markers along the lines, and obviously we're being self-selective to a point, but could you maybe talk through how you view kind of these key realist thinkers and how they kind of saw the world within the context in which they lived, and maybe pick out a few markers, and then we can kind of run up to the American context.
So I think whether it's reading the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, where of course the Million Dialogue comes from, or whether it's reading The Prince by Machiavelli, I think these are important texts to read. I think these are valuable texts to read for their own sake. But I would prefer, as a professor of international relations, if people did not start with those and maybe didn't even come to those until much later in the process. And the reason why is because I think what happens is when people read that, they read onto it our current understanding of things, and then they go back and they look and they read Thucydides and they go, look, 2,000 years ago, someone was thinking just the same way I was thinking here. And it's like, well, no, there's a lot of like going on there. And this is a complex book and you got to unpack things and you got to put in. Yes, that quote is there about the weak must suffer and the strong can do whatever they want. That is absolutely there. But there's a lot of other stuff there too. And you have to kind of understand that, really think through that. And it's the same thing with Machiavelli. I have a colleague here, John McCormick, who is like a world-renowned, thinker on Machiavelli, and he's written all sorts of stuff on Machiavelli. And it's like Machiavelli is not just someone you can just talk about, or you can approach him from a political science perspective. But I also have another colleague here at the University of Chicago, Ada Palmer, who's a historian who also teaches a class on Machiavelli, and it's from the historian standpoint. And there's like a whole other way of understanding Machiavelli. So it's like bringing in these ancient thinkers, even though these tend to be the people that you want to bring in and talk about to try to justify the realist view. I don't think that's appropriate because we tend to import our modern understanding of things onto them. But number two is it's not necessary. We can just take realist thought as it applies to international politics on its own terms. And for me, realist thought was something that very much developed because of World War I. And even then, you could go back a few steps further, and you could say it was developing modern understandings of realist thought were developing going back into the 19th century. There's been some great books written about that recently, about kind of as the allure of international law was picking up, and there was more and more of these like international treaties being signed, global treaties, multilateral treaties in the 19th century. Going back to my earlier point, there was also the view of international law is not going to solve everything, right? We still have imperialism, we still have this will to power. So you can see where modern realism was developing really in the 19th century, but I would argue that the way that we think about it in the context of international relations is really a product of World War I, and in particular, the view that the Hague Conventions, which were signed in 1899, in 1907, these were the first attempts to ever try to create a international law framework, that a multilateral international law framework to control war, maybe even ban war. And they failed. And one of my favorite realist thinkers on this is Mers Tate, who she wrote in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Her dissertation was on the Hague Conventions. Her dissertation that was published as a book in 1942 was titled The Disarmament Illusion. That's all you need to know, right? And that's the full title is right there. But it was a history of the Hague Conventions, the attempts to form them. And she has this great line in the book where she says, early 20th century, the states signed on to these prohibitions on using gas, on treatments of prisoners of war, all of these prohibitions. And then come 1914, those were all pushed aside.
As soon as the chips were down.
As soon as the chips were down, we're just, we are going back to just what we do. And that to me was like a definitive realist view. And that was kind of the view that came about. So that in a nutshell is, it's not to say, trust me, I am not saying don't read Thucydides, don't read Machiavelli, but I think if you want to understand modern realist thought, that's not where you should be starting with this.
No, from a practical perspective, understanding today. And then you're talking about this 1907 moment. There's a lot of history here at Carnegie Council in terms of like seeing what's coming next around the corner and attempting to mitigate that. And it feels very much like that today in terms of having so much time in proximity since the last big thing,
Yeah.
right? And we talk a lot about that today in terms of kind of the normative the normative responsibilities as it gets kind of eroded when generations turn over, and we're both
Mhm.
from a gap right now from a historical perspective, but then also as you talked about a realist perspective, it seems a new cycle might be emerging. A quick intervention, I want to get your reaction to this. So from the Melian dialogue perspective, and for our listeners, right, Athens goes in there and they basically wipe them out. They wipe out this island. And Joel Rosenthal, who's the president of Carnegie Council, who my listeners will know well, he says to me when we're first starting to work together, he goes, well, the lesson of that from the Carnegie Council perspective is not that Athens was able to do whatever they wanted through power. It's that this and a bunch of other decisions that were amoral in nature basically led to civilizational rot and the eventual collapse of Athens. And so, like, we're thinking about it at the council in terms of power, but to what end? Yes, they had the ability to do this, but should they do this? And I think if you're taking a lesson from a realist perspective from that and importing it today, especially into the US perspective, it's okay, we can do this, but does this align with our present day values as historically understood in the proximity of the last 80 years? And this is like the big ethical realist question from our perspective of the moment right now.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that realism is often it's often put forward as like the caricature of realism is it's amoral. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with ethics, it has nothing to do with morals. And one of the key 20th century figures to think about realism, and indeed is considered the father of modern realism, is Hans Morgenthau, at the University of Chicago, and writing in the 1940s, his foundational books, Scientific Man and Power Politics, and then his Politics Among Nations are kind of considered these like founding realist texts. And I teach from these texts, and they're important texts go, especially his book, which was a shorter book, his 46 book, Scientific
Yep.
Man and Power Politics. I think it's just a really
Yep.
good book to read. But he also wrote a lot on ethics, and he
Yep.
even wrote about ethical issues. And it would be a mistake to say that realism has nothing to do with ethics and that it's amoral and you have no values and there's no values. It's you can think about this. I mean, it can get complicated, but you can think about this in many ways. Is
Yep.
on the one hand, you could say having a realist view is indifferent to whether you have values or not. Like you can have values and you can have a certain set of values and be a
Yep.
realist, and those set of
Yeah.
values could vary quite a bit.
Yep.
You can see that in terms of certain people who will label themselves as realists, but say that race relations are a key part of the organizing principles of international relations. You
Yep.
could see people who would take that view who maybe are imperialists, because we do
Yep.
see that, people who were imperialism and they had certain views of hierarchy of races, but that was a value they had, the value of like white supremacy, if you will. But that,
Yep.
they could take a realist frame. But you could go back to someone like Merce Tate that I was talking about, who herself would identify as someone who had a race-informed view of realism. And she herself was an African American. She was the first Black woman to receive a PhD from Harvard in
Well,
government. And she also had a view that was about realism, but hers was about, yes, there are these racial tensions, there are these racial problems, but they can be addressed. But at the same time, we shouldn't be deluding ourselves about what
yeah.
can be a solution to and what can't be a solution to.
Yeah.
So in both cases, you can have a different set of values. And here I'm using kind of your views of race as
Yeah.
being almost an extreme view of it that can lead to different perceptions of what it means to be realist. And in both
Yeah.
cases, they can both have the same idea of, yeah, we're not going to solve the problem of power in the world, but it's independent of what our racial or what
Yeah.
our value system is.
Yeah. So this is one example of something that I think ethics provides somewhat of a framework or a prescription to, especially in this tension between theory and practice. Um, and within theory, right, there's this tension between like a being able to mitigate against the main theoretical strands that are tying your worldview together, right? And so, as you talked about, there is a spectrum of people within realism in terms of mitigating anarchy and what power actually is and how it is wielded, right? And so there's varying conceptions and variability within that. I think what ethics does for us at Carnegie Council is, especially around the values point, right? It's like we're not pushing a universal set of values on everybody. We might have a preference, but within international relations, ethics allows people to mitigate or engage with differing value systems that are going to be there based on a differing state system across the world. And so it's interesting to kind of think about who the different thinkers that allow for the amount of variability when it comes to realism, because some of them, as we know, are quite hardcore at one spectrum, and other ones, as Joseph Nye explains in his book Do Morals Matter, well, presidents are basically all a mix of cosmopolitanism, realism, and liberalism, and it's just a spectrum there. And show me a realist, I'll show you a liberal on another day.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think there's a lot to that. Another way to contrast it is, often when people think of realism and they think of foreign policy, they think of the individual, especially U.S. foreign policy. They think of the individual I brought up earlier, which is Henry Kissinger. You usually think of Kissinger as like, realpolitik, right? He was someone who, if we have to bomb Cambodia, that's just what we have to do, because that's just what is necessary for the U.S. to secure itself. And it doesn't matter how many innocent people are killed. This is the reality of the world. That's at least, the reason that people have been highly critical of Kissinger's foreign policy. And they will typically contrast it, I myself have done this, with, say, the foreign policy of Jimmy Carter, right? So in that, Jimmy Carter seemed like he was on the other end of this in terms of allowing kind of his values and having a different set of values, kind of guiding his view of foreign policy, and that, no, we have to take a view that there is a way of improving humanity. There is, a responsibility in terms of how we use force. There's a responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility in terms of helping those who can't help themselves. This is the typical view of, Jimmy Carter and his view of things. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That's why he received a Nobel Peace Prize, the Carter Center. They've done a lot of great things. But what's interesting is, once you start studying the two individuals, you see that they are very much a mix of both these things, right? There were definitely things Jimmy Carter did, like trying to free the hostages from Iran, the sanctions in response to the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, and then even boycotting the Olympic Games, sanctions on the Soviet Union, taking a very tough line there, of saying, no, like, look, this is, he's using his values. There's certain values, but then he's saying, we are going to be, if you will, we're going to use our power as a way of kind of exerting those values. And Jimmy Carter did that in his own way, in the same way that, Henry Kissinger did at times too. I mean, think about the whole idea of Nixon going to China. People talk about that, but Nixon went to China because Henry Kissinger first went to China. Right. And Henry Kissinger, you could say, oh, there was like realist calculation and that and so forth. But in many ways, it was an idea of, maybe we can actually like get along. Maybe there's actually a way that we can create some common ground and maybe get along. And many people put that forward as like something that, even if you're a critic of Nixon, you say, wow, him opening up relations with China was a really great move and a positive move. But that was Henry Kissinger who laid the groundwork for that. So it's a complex mix of both.
No, and I think that you're hitting on basically one of the things that there's a tension point today in kind of this conflation of realism with just bold strength and military action, right? Like Kissinger, from a realpolitik perspective, was like, I need to start opening up a line of communication to China, and that might have been a realist calculation to split the difference with Russia, right? And like, there's been tons of writing about this, but I'm sure he would, if he was still alive today, was being interviewed about that, he would say that was of course it was a realist calculation. I just used the means that the U.S. had based on its diplomacy, based on its history of reciprocity, right? That we're not just this amoral expansionist actor. Obviously, tactically, policy-wise, tons of examples of that. But on the whole, I think that's what we're seeing change now. The North Star is different, right? It's transactionalism, it's military force first, it's reciprocity second, right? And so like this realism is being morphed, and agree, disagree, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it right now. And then I guess on to close before I get your response to that, what we're talking a lot about at the council right now is you talk about Jimmy Carter to Kissinger, that spectrum, this realpolitik in the middle. The other end of that is this matchpolitik that our president talks about a lot, and this is closer to this amoral realism. And is that even can that even be a thing in an open society? So I said a lot there, but I'm going to have you throw that back at me or say, Kevin, you're wrong.
No, I think, the idea of matchpolitik, or what I would say is that realism should not be confused with militarism. And so that's kind of the idea that oftentimes they are put together, that, okay, if you're a realist, then you recognize that it's a pipe dream you're ever going to solve the problem of war. That doesn't mean that you go around fighting wars, right? That doesn't mean that you go around fighting wars. It means you are cognizant of the fact that you're not going to be able to solve that problem, and so you do need to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you can't reduce the potential pain of that problem. And it doesn't mean that you yourself can't be constrained in how you make use of the instruments of warfare. So just because you sit there and say, it's kind of like saying, well, since we can't fix that, might as well just go all in. It's like, no, realism doesn't say that. What it just says is you're not going to be able to fix it, but you yourself can still be prudent in the use and the pursuit of foreign policy. Yeah. You yourself can still choose whether to use those instruments in a restrained manner and in a sensible manner, or use them. Realism in no way tells you that you have to make the use of military power your first instrument. Yeah. And I think what has happened in my read on the current political climate, and especially with respect to how the Trump administration, or at least some people within the Trump administration, have put forward the realist approach that they're taking, is been putting the military and the use of militarism as the first instrument of foreign policy. Yeah. Even if it's not used, which unfortunately it is being used, but it is being threatened. It is like, we're going to put that out there right away. We're going to start off with, by the way, we could invade. By the way, we can attack. Oh, let me show you. We can launch these boat strikes. Let me show you. In fact, we're even going to just relabel the Department of Defense the Department of War, and we're going to talk about warrior ethos, and we're going to talk about all this. And it's like, you're putting that instrument, and realism doesn't tell you that you have to do that. You can have a realist view of the world, but not be like, therefore, I'm going to go around and be militaristic. Again, realism does not mean militarism.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of the narrative become reality. There's this irony right now in that from the top of the presidency, right? It used to be the president steps to the podium and basically his word is policy. Right now, there couldn't be a bigger gap between that existing. But at the same time, people like Hegseth and Rubio and Vance are signaling really significant changes around how the U.S. conceives of its power, its role in the world. And, my work right now is I'm specifically studying narratives and values in the U.S. context. And I just keep coming back to this one thing that happened in 2025. So Secretary Hegseth, he's in the Oval Office with President Trump, and he's talking about the rename. He's signing the executive order to rename the Department of Defense, Department of War. And he goes, we are going to, quote, focus on maximum lethality, not tepid legality. And you can draw a straight line from September 2025 to January 2nd, 2026, when they go into Venezuela. And so there's this weird thing happening right now where you simultaneously can't believe anything they're saying, and you have to take everything at face value, even if normatively it seems crazy to a certain extent. And and at every one of these things, it's kind of, as you said, this masculine caricature of realism. And as you said before, people connect with realism because it's not like a term like cosmopolitanism where you're like, oh, what the heck does that mean? Right? It's something that every person can attach some emotion to, some action to, even if they've never studied international relations, which most people haven't. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, and I definitely commented on like Hegseth when he gave a speech to all the flag staff of the U.S. Armed Forces and so forth, and That was and to me, the whole idea of maximizing lethality and not the tepid legality. Or I actually did laugh at the phrase in his cover letter to the National Defense Strategy, where he said cloud castle, something like cloud
It
castle
was like
idea.
internationalism or something.
Cloud castle ideas of rules-based order. I kind of laughed at that one, but but it's the same idea of like, oh, why do we talk about these things? But to me, I'm like, that is absolutely a caricature of what it means and even what it takes to win wars. And to me, I can't think of a greater military thinker than Dwight Eisenhower. And it's like, you can't argue with this. He was the supreme Allied commander during World War II. You can't argue with this. He's the one who's like, we're doing D-Day and I'm taking responsibility if it fails, right? This is the epitome of it. And he was also the epitome of the idea that amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. And he understood that. He also understood that an overemphasis on militarism is bad for society. And of course, that is well captured in his farewell address when he talked about the military-industrial complex. And he made a point of emphasizing how this amount of money spent on the military will take away from money that could be spent on schools, hospitals, and other things that societies need. And here is someone that you just can't argue with them in terms of their, if you will, their masculinity with respect to militarism. I mean, again, this is the person who, was the supreme Allied commander of Europe, World War II. And he is also probably the biggest skeptic of the idea of having a warrior ethos, lethal at the top. His view is World War II was won by a bunch of people who would rather have been doing something else, rather than a bunch of people who are excited about the idea of getting involved in a war. These are people who would rather be doing something else. And in an ideal society, these people are able, for most of the time, to go and do something else, right? And that is very much a realist. He was very much a realist because he was not an idealist. He knew how this was going. He was signing military alliances during his time as president. It was the Pactomania. We're signing this alliance, this alliance. He's very much about containing the Soviet Union, but he's also trying to bring about what the Atoms for Peace program. He's saying maybe we can actually develop this too because I am worried about nuclear weapons. And that kind of set the stage for the NPT and for the IAEA. So he's doing this at the same time that he's like, but we also got to form alliances to contain. That's a realist view of the world. It's like it's not Cloud Castle, if you will.
Yeah, no, and I think this brings to life what you were talking about before, the virtues of pragmatism and prudence and even restraint, especially within an open society, a democracy that purports to align with certain liberal values. That doesn't mean we're going to allow things to happen that are, against those values or against our security interests. But it also means there's restraint. Like, we're not an empire. Yeah. There's a big difference in that pre and post 1945, kind of the context of today. And then, you talked about Eisenhower, again, going back to Joseph Nye, he talks about Truman and this decision not to drop nuclear weapons during the Korean War. He has a blank check from Congress. MacArthur is hammering him publicly to be able to do this. And he did authorize the dropping of weapons in World War II. And then for what seems to be moral, ethical considerations, he said, just because I can doesn't mean I should, right? And I don't want more, this isn't a direct quote, but basically he says, like, I don't want more dead kids, right? And that's not nothing from international relations, but that's millions of people alive today because he decided to make not the blank check decision. He decided to ask the question, power to what end? And I think that decision and what you talked about with Eisenhower, two kind of great examples of post-World War II pragmatic American realism. You're not giving away the farm, but you're also not giving away the values at the same time.
No, it's exactly. Truman is a great example of this because, kind of where if you hold out Eisenhower, it's like you can't argue about him and masculine militarism or whatever, however you want to go with it. you also can't argue about Truman. Like, the atomic bomb is the most devastating weapon. And if you're going to
Yep.
talk about maximum lethality, you're talking about nuclear weapons. And
Yep.
he is the president that these weapons were used. And I've talked and written about kind of his quote decisions to use it. And, on the one hand, there wasn't a decision per se to use it. I think, and it's worth kind of taking a moment to talk a little bit about this, that,
Yep.
as, like, for example, Alex Wellerstein, who just wrote a book about.
I cannot wait to read that book. He's been at the
Yes.
council before, and
I
I
think it's
cannot
like
wait to read it.
titled
Yeah.
like The Most Horrible Decision or something
Yeah.
like that. And it's but it's about kind of, this process of dropping the atomic bombs. And I've been a fan of his work for a while, but he points out that there was never, there's not a situation room it wasn't like, oh, we sit there and thinking about, like, people have in their mind something like the Osama bin Laden raid, where the president's weighing this, and then you're going to make a call, and then you're going to drop it, and then they're going to do this. There wasn't anything like that. It wasn't like he was sitting there at the beginning of August and he said, okay, I'm making the call. We're going to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. It was just more, there were a series of decisions that he also was part of that led to the dropping of it. Where he did make a decision is, we're not going to do a third. It was after the first two, and that was kind of like baked in. We're doing this, dropping this. And that was where the statement came in, where he did say, according to the people who were there, that he said, we can't have more dead kids. Basically, family, we can't keep doing this. So he where it is acknowledged he made a decision, was saying, we're not going to do a third. Now, it wasn't clear, if Japan doesn't surrender, do they go on and do they do more? But he kind of came to the realization that this is enough, and we're going to stop there. And I think that was already where he's starting to get this view that then informed his decision later on during the Korean War to be like, no, we're not going to do this, just for the same reason why that was, he recognized the horror of what was happening there. And in that sense, it's similar to this idea. It's similar to what I was saying about Eisenhower, which is that, again, these are two individuals where you cannot question the extent to which they understood maximum lethality, and they understood the use of violent power in the international system. And these are two people who came to a realization that that is not something that you just do because you can do it, that there is a heightened responsibility maybe when you can do it. And that necessitates, again, kind of that with great power comes great responsibility view. And in many ways, that is a realist view.
Yep. No, it's this relationship between power and principle that we think deeply about here at the council. And if I was going to distill it down to one thing in the practice of international relations from our perspective, it's that, right? And I think two very interesting case studies. I think, as you said, with Kissinger and Nixon, that's another really interesting period. The period that we are in now definitely poses some challenges in terms of that relationship and what does that look like moving forward. As I said before, you see kind of multiple sub actors in the Trump administration, and each of them has their own view, and I would say wielding significant power differently in terms of like this relationship between U.S. values and U.S. interests. And I said, like, the Hegseth version, which might be a little bit more one-dimensional and masculine, and then you have the anti-authoritarian Rubio kind of older school version. You have the Vance, which is kind of civilizational erasure and Western defense, and then you have somebody who's obviously not at that cabinet level, but like Elbridge Colby, who is at the Munich Security Conference, giving a more pragmatic, strategic view of, well, realism for us is a focus on China and self-care for the Europeans when it comes to Russia. And so it's hard to track all this. It is always in some extent for other administrations, but it seems to be more fractured and more chaotic now. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
My thoughts would be, if I had to, like, yeah, you are 100% right, that I think many members of the administration at different levels want to have used the language of realism. If I had to pick one that I think is closer to actual realism, it would be Colby. I think he's the one that maybe he actually understands it better than the others. Because I do think that you've seen this language used more, and used in a way that goes against kind of what we talked about. I mean, even looking at some of the documents that have come out of the administration, like the national security strategy is an interesting document. Let's put it to you like that. No, I've written about how it is very clear that the notions of racial dominance, racism, white supremacy are evident in there, but not in all of it. There's other parts of it that are more like kind of what you would expect to find in any national security strategy. It seemed like it was something that was written by like 4 or 5 different people.
Yes.
And you can
my thoughts exactly. It feels very tactical.
Yeah.
And it feels kind of attempting to please many people to keep a coalition together.
Yeah.
Supporters. And actually somebody wrote me a very funny note the other day. I will not reveal who, but there was a very odd usage, I think in the national security strategy, or it might have been the defense strategy, of a of a semicolon somewhere. And he was like, ChatGPT definitely wrote this line, wrote the line of this.
Yeah, and then you have to throw in that there was some ChatGPT going
there
on.
Might be fun. There might be a 5th author somewhere in San Francisco. Yeah,
exactly. No, it's 100%. You can tell with the parts where you're like, I wonder if Stephen Miller wrote that part. And then I think that's the part that maybe Elbridge Colby wrote. And then that's the part that So it was like, there were different elements. And then that's also why the document kind of contradicts itself at points and so forth. But I mean, it does point to, we can pick on, well, it's not picking on because you can't pick on people in power, but, we can criticize the Trump administration and people in the Trump administration for how they've used realism. But the reality is that this is not unique to them. Yeah. Right. Like, and I think that's a big part of the conversation today is that realism is this idea that is easy to invoke, easy to bring up, easy to use to justify a foreign policy view or a view about the world, but people can use it in a way that is trying to do more than what it was actually intended to do. Yeah. And that's why I always come back to this notion of realism is this idea of, again, it's the school of no hope. It's the curmudgeon of international relations thought. It is the idea that, nope, sorry, don't, not so fast. We're not going to see this all get solved. Now, once you start adding in assumptions to that, you can then take that framework to start coming up with theories of how states should behave or how this, and then that's where you start to get theories of realism. So you start to get, people will talk about defensive realism, offensive realism, different types of neoclassical realism. There's all sorts of different realisms, human nature realism, system realism. The list goes on and on. But those
now we're getting the new neo-royalism, which would be realism adjacent with a world run by transactional oligarchs.
Yes, exactly. So you're getting all these different ones, and some of them are better than others in terms of explaining things at certain times, but they're all theories that are built on the framework of realism, where that framework is just this idea of the world is not going to eliminate. There are certain inherent features about the world that will not lead to the ability to solve the problem of war. Yep. And, this is, and I think it's important to think about it as that framework. It's a philosophical framework. It's even to the extent, and Morgenthau himself would have talked about this, it's even a theological framework.
Yes. You wrote about this the other day. I was going to get to this, but I definitely, let's go.
Let's go. Okay, let's go to this now. No, this is so, and I present this to my students and say, so Morgenthau in his book, Scientific Man and Power Politics, when he's talking about the views that realism stands against, the views of like, international law is going to solve all this, democracy is going to solve all this, commerce is going to solve all this. Yep. And he's talking about these views, which tend to fall into the umbrella of liberalism, Big L, classic realism.
He was not a fan of the utopianism.
Yes, and so people will call this the idealism, utopianism. But what he says is that all of these views have at their center an eschatological hope. And what that means is that is a theological term that is in reference to the notion of the consummation of all things. So, for example, in Christian thought, the idea is the eschatology is like the second coming of Christ, right? That he will come and it's going to bring about peace and prosperity. There will be the judgment of those who are wicked. There'll be, the glory of those who have lived, who are good and are in his grace. And then everything will be wonderful for here to eternity. And so that is an eschatology as expressed through Christianity. But the whole idea of eschatology is that there is this like end state that you can reach where everything will be like complete. And what he says is that these other views of whether it's the spread of international law, whether it's the spread of democracy, it's the spread of commerce, all have that view that this is eventually going to take us to an end state. That is going to be, everything's going to be great and it'll all be solved forever. And what he's saying is that's not, realism does not say that. And so this leads to another theological view, which is that realism isn't so much a theory, but it is a theodicy. And theodicy is another theological concept. Theodicy is the area of theological thought that tries to explain why there's pain and suffering in the world, which seems very appropriate when you're trying to talk about war. Why does war happen? And if you're trying to say wars can't be solved, it seems like you're trying to offer an explanation for why pain and suffering is in the world. And of course, the reason why this gets brought up in a theological concept is, especially if you're using Christianity as the example here, if you're the one where it's, an all-powerful, all-loving God, people say, well, then why would he allow a world, or why would God, allow a world where there's pain and suffering, right? And so theodicies try to explain that. Well, realism is a theodicy. Realism is saying, this is why the world is this way. Humans have this desire for control and power, or the international system lacks a world government. And because of that, we will always have incentives to go to war and so forth. And so some people have said that realism is theodicy without eschatology. That basically it is an explanation for why there is pain and suffering, there is war in the world, and it holds that we will not reach an end state. Yeah. We are not going to be able to go to that point. So that's how then it's not just even a philosophy, it's even a theology.
Yeah. And I have to send you this article. I'm sure you've come across it. It's from the mid-50s, but it's basically a publication of the letters that Reinhold Niebuhr and Hans Morgenthau wrote back and forth with each other. And this is basically what you're talking about. So for my listeners, Reinhold Niebuhr is this famous Christian realist, I will call him. And really, Morgenthau and Niebuhr informed one another. Niebuhr was more focused on domestic politics. He wrote this book, Moral Man and Moral Society. But they had this amazing friendship, intellectual relationship back and forth. And, from as a Christian, Niebuhr understood, I think, from a realist perspective, but was a bit higher up in terms of capabilities to improve and push society forward. And that's where the tension emerged with Morgenthau a bit, but a very friendly tension and an intellectually respectful tension, which is something we don't really have that much nowadays. So I will put that article on the link to this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Niebuhr is, in he's many ways, like when people think about realism and the intersection of realism and theology and specifically Christianity, Niebuhr is the first and foremost individual who's brought up there. And you're exactly right. Morgenthau had a lot of influence from a variety of individuals because Morgenthau himself kind of evolved from being someone who originally was writing a lot about international law. And eventually, in the 1930s and so forth, that he kind of came to this realization, like, this isn't going to solve this. And, these conversations with people like Niebuhr, he also was very much influenced by the work of Merce Tate. So he was influenced by a variety of people to kind of develop what we, again, have kind of now as this modern understanding of realism.
Yeah. No, I need to go back and reread some of the international law, like over a time span, like earlier works and then critiques, because we're in a moment right now in terms of the realist critique of international law. And how we think about it at the council is, yes, international law was a normative thing for a bit. It wasn't always perfect, but people who thought it could exist outside of the underwriting of a powerful state were the chickens are kind of coming home to roost right now on that. And there's a great lecture by Yanina Dill at Oxford about a year and a half ago, and she's an international law expert, but she just ends the lecture basically making this point, like, power needs to underpin this, or it's just going to go the way of the dodo. So I'll try to circulate that to the listeners as well. I wanted to kind of end with a specific question in terms of, again, the moment that we are in today. And obviously you're an academic, Paul, but you're also writing a lot on the current political moment. And so if we look at the spectrum that we talked about, from Jimmy Carter to amoral, kind of match politique, where do you think the energy is, right? The normative energy right now in US politics? Are we going closer to Elbridge Colby, or are we going closer to Stephen Miller? Yeah, I don't want to give you the crystal ball, but like, how are you reading the room right now?
So I think that one way to answer that's a big question, but I think one way to answer that question, and it ties in nicely to what we're talking about, is I think there is a need for, and I think it will resonate, is the idea of a no drama foreign policy. Like, we just don't need the drama. And what do I mean by drama is, it's not that bad stuff isn't happening in the world, but why are we intentionally causing bad stuff? Why are we creating tension? Why are we creating arguments? Why are we being a problem when there's already enough bad stuff happening in the world? I actually thought there was a really great statement, and I actually teach with this statement. So if you go back to when Marco Rubio first became Secretary of State, I've been giving Marco Rubio some pretty good marks in terms of his usage of IR concepts in much of his talking. And during when he first became Secretary of State, both if you look at his opening remarks during his confirmation hearing, but he also subsequently did an interview. I think it might have been with Megyn Kelly, but he did an interview shortly after becoming Secretary of State, kind of talking about his vision of things. But one of the things he talked about, and it was a line that I've used quite a bit, is trying to justify why the Trump administration was going to be taking the approach it was taking. He said the following. He said, there are a lot of horrible things happening in the world. There really are. And then there are horrible things happening in the world that are actually in U.S. interest to try to address. And we need to focus on those things. And I actually thought that was a good line, because it acknowledged that, yes, there's all sorts of bad stuff happening, but there are bad things that we can actually focus on, and we should just center ourselves on those. And I would contrast that with the view that was typically attributed to Hillary Clinton, where she was, she used the phrase, be caught trying. The U.S. needs to be caught trying to try to fix problems. Even if we can't solve it, it's, kind of building on that notion from Madeleine Albright, we're the indispensable nation. We have to try to be involved. And Rubio is giving a view that we can't be involved everywhere. We have to kind of pick our shots, if you will, of what we can fix and what we can't fix, which you could argue is very much a realist view of how to be involved in the world. What's interesting is the extent to which that has and hasn't been the guiding principle of the Trump administration, right? It's like, yes, they've been selective, but they've almost been selective in saying, well, yes, there's horrible things happening in the world. There's horrible things that we can do something about. And then there's a whole other set of things that we can just create problems out of thin air that weren't problems to begin with, but we've decided to make them problems, right? Like we're going to go and start making demands for Greenland. Where did that come from? Why do we?
Well, I think this is, in my opinion, it's because a new variable has been introduced that used to be kind of null, but now it is really influential, which is transactional considerations for people around him that are really influential. And if I can give the Morgenthau critique to the Rubio to Clinton spectrum, it's the liberal idealism overstretch, which manifests as Bush, post 2001, and Clinton in a way, right? There's the non-pragmatic side of that, and then I'd say the trade-off, the criticism Morgenthau would give Rubio is, you are kind of trading short-term tactical wins for potentially strategic giving away the farm at the end of the day, because you're contracting too much, right? And there's going to be another pandemic, or there's this isn't like this liberal utopia, right? There are things where we need to be in the world to secure our interests in this interconnected world. So, I do not have the answers. I'm just given the put on the Morgenthau hat for a minute and try to criticize both sides.
Exactly. And to me, like the perfect example of this, like the benefit of a no drama foreign policy is look at the Maduro raid.
Yeah.
And one thing that I've been saying, I've been talking quite a bit about that and different outlets, and I've been writing about it. But one thing I brought up is that should have been an easy win for the Trump administration. Like Maduro was not popular in Venezuela. There's a lot of, of course, people who have come to the United States because of the turmoil in Venezuela, and they don't like him. He's not popular among leaders of Latin America. He is someone that, yes, it would be illegal to go in, just like it was illegal to go in and remove Manuel Noriega from Panama. Yes, it would be illegal to do that. But by and large, people would be like, hey, you know what, though? We're glad he's gone. And I've even gone to the point to say if Harris had won, I could have seen Harris actually carrying out a similar operation, because I think Harris would have put more of a priority on this and the issues with Venezuela and so forth. Somehow, Trump took what should have been an easy win that gets lots of support, and he made the U.S. into the bad guy. This should have been something easy. And the question is, how? How did he do that? Well, the way he did it was all the boat strikes going on for months leading up to this, already starting to generate massive ill will internationally about the U.S.'s use of force in the Caribbean, and the seeming like using force for the sake of it, violence for the sake of violence. That's already putting it onto having people already being highly skeptical of anything the U.S. is doing there. Versus if the U.S. had taken a more prudent approach of, you know what, we are going to remove him. He is a problem. Yes, we recognize this is going to be a violation of international law, but it's something we need to do. We're going to build up our forces. We're going to carry out this operation. We're going to try to do it in as clean and straightforward as way as possible to minimize casualties. And then we're going to move on. That actually, I think, would have generated a lot of support. And so I use that as an example of that's where creating unnecessary drama and doing unnecessary things is almost in many ways self-defeating to something that actually could be and indeed is a key policy priority even for this administration.
Yeah. So I think the all great point. I think the Chicago Council, which you're affiliated with, is a fellow that does amazing public policy and geopolitical research on U.S. domestic views on foreign policy, right? And so I think this is an example. This is an extension of the Trump administration using a hammer when they could have used a scalpel in the lead up to it, because they're basically playing to that 30% of the electorate. And I think this is a big normative political shift where the presidency now in the U.S., even at very tough times, you think of the 2000 election, the position of the president was always, yes, it can be dicey on domestic issues, child tax credit or healthcare, right? But I'm still, from a foreign policy perspective, I am governing for the American people, the collective interests. And it seems that a lot of these foreign policy decisions, whether it's the rhetoric, whether it's actual policies, are playing to a certain common denominator. And it's just like primary season on the international stage. So that's concerning from a U.S. interest perspective. But yes, I would highly recommend Chicago Council if you want to understand the U.S. electorate's view on foreign policy. Amazing resources.
100%. Yeah, they're polling, and they just this year, last year's poll, because they do every year like a massive survey of the American public's views, was the 50th year of it. So there's 50 years of this like polling data of like views of the American public on its role in the world. And it's fascinating data because you can kind of see bipartisan and how it's evolved over time. And that it's exactly right. There's definitely a segment of the American public that I guess you could say maybe likes the drama, but it's not the majority. And it's not even, and it's bipartisan in terms of people who would prefer not to have the drama.
No, and it's not. And that's empirically true. I was looking at the Chicago Council data the other day on support for NATO. It has not really dropped, right? Even like even that's being hammered and hammered. Well, I'm actually going to close with one more question. We'll let you go because we're a little over time. But we've talked a lot about kind of the kind of the traditional writers and texts. If somebody wants to get their hands around realism right now, you are in the classroom, Paul. Like, what are you assigning? Who, if someone wanted to start getting deeper in this today, like, what should they read? Who should they be following?
Wow, that's I love that question. Well, they can follow me, they can read me as always. For example, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs in 2022 titled "A World of Power and Fear," and I used that as a primer. And that was during that last moment. It was kind of talking about the role of realism, and it's a fairly short piece, and I think that's a good one to work with. But I really do like having my students go back to kind of some of the work by Morgenthau and having them read this and read about it to understand, kind of the view of realism as it is understood now. Now, that's if you want to go a little bit longer. And in that case, it would be the book I recommended already several times, which is Scientific Man versus Power Politics. But another one is another work that I have assigned many times, going back kind of to what I consider classic work. So again, not ancient work, we're not going back to Peloponnesian War, but is what I also referenced earlier, which is Philip Kerr, Kerr, and his paper in 1928 titled "The Outlawry of War." And that was in, what is today called International Affairs, but at the time was like the Journal of the Royal International Society, but Chatham House's in-house journal. And that journal, that paper is a great paper because that's where he uses the phrase "practical people." And he talks about, like, he's writing that at the time that they're trying to sign the Briand-Kellogg Pact to literally ban war. And he just talks about how this is just not going to happen. And it's an article. It's a really nice piece to kind of put in very clearly, like, oh, this is what people are talking about. And this is, kind of the alternative view. And this is where these ideas came from. So, again, I'm going to recommend my own piece, but I'm also going to recommend going back to kind of the classic piece of Morgenthau or that paper by Kerr.
Great. Well, Paul, this is such a great conversation. I know my audience really appreciates it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
To listen, learn, and reflect on the most critical issues at the intersection of ethics and international affairs, be sure to subscribe to Carnegie Council wherever you get your podcasts.